Good evening. Thank you for joining us for the keynote lecture of the 2013 Humanities Symposium. We've had a wonderful day of rich conversations with lots of different people, and we've been so grateful to have Dr. Jeffrey Harpham here. He joined us for our reception last night and has been very present up till this moment and will continue to be very present, I'm sure, but he's definitely stimulated and engaged us in really great conversation. We're very thankful for it. If you don't know about the Center for Public Humanities, our aim is to collaborate and join in initiatives with different stakeholders in the community and within the college about humanities and what the humanities has to offer our world today, how we can engage the most pressing problems, and what sorts of skills and knowledge and creative capacities we can bring through the humanities to our communities and to the world. And we've had a wonderful day of talking about wealth and abundance, the promises and perils in all sorts of ways and through many different lenses. We also have programs that engage high school students. We host the regional debate and forensic teams. We will be hosting History Day next week on March 2nd. And we have a course in the community here in Harrisburg that gives access to college. It's a bridge program for people who haven't had access to college. And it's one of the real delights of the Center for Public Humanities to be able to engage in those kinds of conversation. We also have a Teachers and Scholars program. I think there's some brochures out there, and it's for local Central Pennsylvania high school students. We offer Act 48 credit, and it's a great opportunity for high school teachers who are teaching in the humanities to think about new discoveries in the content areas, think about the relevance it has for their own teaching, talk with each other. And so if you're a high school teacher, I urge you to find out more about the Teachers and Scholars program. You can find out about it online, and we have brochures in the back. But the Humanities Symposium is one of the most important things we do. And it does give us the opportunity to talk about a theme in all sorts of ways. We have with us tonight Dr. Jeffrey Harpham, and he is the director and president of the National Humanities Center at the Research Triangle Park in North Carolina. He's been there for 10 years, and they are doing amazing things. And I think one of the real privileges that we've had in discussing the humanities with Dr. Harpham today is the way he's framed the conversation for us, because he certainly has framed it in a time where so much of what we talk about and so much what we hear is scarcity and fear. He is very confident about the future of humanities, and he talks about it in a way that is very generative. So I'm very eager to hear what he has to share with us tonight. He has written and thought about almost everything under the sun, but he did begin his career in literary criticism, and he wrote such books as On the Grotesque Strategies of Contradiction in Art and Literature, Shadows of Ethics, Criticism in the Just Society, and Language Alone, The Critical Fetish of Modernity. We had a great conversation with him at the English department this morning. But more recently, most of his scholarship has been on the humanities. And tonight we're going to hear Melancholy in the Midst of Abundance. And this research is in his book, The Humanities and the Dream of America. And I know that you will love hearing him discuss this with us tonight. Thank you so much for joining us, and thank you for all you've given us to us over the past few days. Welcome, Jeffrey Harpham.
Thank you, Jean. Thanks also to President Phipps and to Provost Basinger and to Dean Powers and to all of you for showing up on this chilly night. How is my voice? It sounds very booming to me. I'm not trying to boom. I wish you could see what I see, the view of you in this magnificent structure. It's absolutely fantastic. It makes me wish even more fervently than I usually do that I could sing. But you won't hear any of that from me tonight, I'm afraid. I understand that this is the maiden voyage for this magnificent hall in terms of an academic lecture, and I knew that we were working a few of the kinks out at the last minute today, because at one point during the sound check, somebody brought out architectural drawings of the place to try to figure out what was where. Let's see. There we go. I've been using PowerPoint for a few years. I remember some time back when I first began to use it, and it was not de rigueur, as it has since become. Somebody came to me after the talk and said, I really like those slides that you gave us. They gave us something to think about while you were talking. So there you have it. Anyhow, my subject today is the humanities. I think it's widely thought to be either a dull subject or a non-subject, in the sense that even humanists, people who've committed their lives to it, don't like to think of themselves as humanists. John Fee and I were talking about this today. They like to think of themselves as literary scholars or philosophers or historians or one thing or another, but they don't like to think of the big category of the humanities. And I think that's because the humanities are kind of an awkward shape and size. It's kind of in the middle region. It doesn't have any kind of local oomph or the ferocity of allegiance like Messiah College or the Tar Heel State or anything like that. And on the other hand, it doesn't have the kind of oceanic satisfaction of the Earth or the globe. We have very fond but vague thoughts. It's kind of like North America in that respect. We have fond but vague thoughts about North America. We're in it, but we're not really of it. And it's just that way with the humanities. When we think about the humanities at all, which we don't like to do, that doesn't seem like there's enough there for thought to fasten on, we presume, I think, that it's a very large, a very ancient thing, a very fine thing, I guess. It goes all the way back to Socrates. It goes all the way out to the far corners of the world. It goes all the way out up to the heights of metaphysics. It's a really fine thing, but one on which thought is wasted because nothing truly interesting can be said about it. Now, I'm going to argue that it is a fine thing. In fact, it's a finer thing than most people, even who have committed their lives to it like I have suspected. But it's not fine in the way that we think it is. It's not just there. It was put there by certain people who had a specific purpose. I'm going to argue that the entire history of the humanities, in the sense that we now inhabit today, lies within the compass of my lifetime. That's a coincidence, I think, but I think it's a fact. During that time, the humanities have become described and defended in a very distinctive kind of rhetoric that occupies the terrain between the vaguely edifying and the altogether vapid. Now, I'm going to force you to focus on some of that rhetoric as if it had some meaning. And contemplate its implications. I'll be taking you through a kind of academic equivalent of the birth of the blues. This is the birth of the cliches that define the humanities. And you can think of some of the distinguished gentlemen that I'm going to be talking about today as like the Big Bill Brunzi or the Huddie Ledbetters of the humanities. My emphasis is primarily historical. The story of how those cliches came to be is actually a lot more interesting than the cliches themselves. And even some of the cliches, if you read them closely, have meanings that we can still find pretty compelling. And most of all, that we do ourselves a big favor if we learn that story. Now, I'm going to treat here as prehistory to the humanities, that is the present-day, contemporary sense of the humanities, classical philosophy, medieval scholasticism, Renaissance humanism, Cambridge Platonism, the Enlightenment, the literae humaniores of Oxford in the 19th century, the new humanism of the 20th century. All these various humanisms function, in my account, like tributary streams that flow into the Susquehanna. One of the main tributaries of that thinking was the work of John Adams, which I put behind me. whose famous fantasy, at least it's famous to humanists, they take great strength from it, expressed in a 1780 letter to his wife, in which he saw his lineage evolving from warriors into dilettantes, has come to seem like a kind of bad historical joke played by the past on the present. We remain stuck, it seems, in the study of politics and war, although I don't think we can say we've gotten much better at them. And the study of tapestry and porcelain has definitely fallen on hard times, or maybe we can say has never yet come into its own. And still, this vision, which Adams then wrote into the Massachusetts Constitution later on in that same year, same language, in fact, is the germ of the modern humanities. That is, the modern humanities as an American invention. I think it's really well worth recalling that once upon a time, the ruling class, which had also been the revolutionary class, had imagined that they were risking their lives and their fortunes and their sacred honor on behalf of a futurity in which what would come to be called the humanities would completely dominate the concerns of the citizenry. The humanities, these people felt, and I'm not only talking about Adams, I'm talking about Jefferson as well and others, would represent the crowning achievement of a nation that, having prevailed in war, would then order itself so successfully, build its society on a foundation of such economic and political and military security that citizens could then voluntarily enrich their experience by turning their attention to the study and appreciation of material and textual artifacts. Now, Adams and Jefferson and the other founding fathers who were sympathetic with this felt that the general enjoyment of this right, and you notice that he calls it a right very specifically, represented the best possible future for the new nation, and that, most important, the natural progress of mankind if they were free from fear and want. In other words, the belief was that if you removed threat and deprivation from human being, the human animal would naturally gravitate towards the study and appreciation and delight in what now is called the humanities. This belief that the unique circumstances of the new nation gave citizens privileged access to the fullness of the human condition determined the development of liberal education in the United States and had the effect, once upon a time, of placing the humanities at the very center of American self-understanding in a way that has not been replicated in any other nation. There's no counterpart, there's no correlative in any other nation. Now, the traumas of the first half of the 20th century didn't bring Adams's vision any closer to realization, but they had made it, I think, seem even more compelling as a distant goal. It was never forgotten. And this vision had already been advanced piecemeal by a number of the educational reformers that dot the history of American education, like Bronson Alcott and John Dewey and Horace Mann, and also by such very well publicized successes as the Great Books program at Chicago or the core curriculum at the University of Columbia, and what was called the program of the humanities at Princeton, which was invented in 1930. It was the very first one. In other words, the humanities is a very recent invention. And so as the Second World War drew to a close, the time finally seemed right for Adams's grandchildren. And so I'm going to start my story by talking about this post-war moment. Now, the Declaration of Independence of the Humanities, if you want to call it that, was a book called the Harvard, there we go. It's called the Harvard Red Book because it was red, if not red in the other sense. The official title was General Education in a Free Society. It was a book-length study produced by a committee of eminent Harvard professors convened in the spring of 1943 during the middle of the war by President James Bryant Conant. Who will we call him? Is he the lead belly of the humanities? Perhaps. The group worked for 2 years as the war was being waged and won, and they published their report as the war ended. This is a wartime document. And the Red Book is concerned with such issues as why we fight, and was written in full awareness of the fact that the educational system was about to be inundated with hundreds and thousands of GIs who had just finished fighting the war, and they would be wanting the education that the GI Bill promised them. So the challenge was to create a system that made available to vastly expanded numbers of people the cultural advantages that had up to that point been available only to a tiny number of people. In his charge to the committee, Cohen said, "The primary concern of American education today is not the development of the appreciation of the good life in young gentlemen born to the purple. It's the infusion of the liberal and humane tradition into our entire educational system." In other words, here's the president of Harvard, the most elite institution in the country, saying that what education has to be about henceforth is not the 12 people who graduate from Harvard each year. It's the mass of society. It's everyone. Our purpose is to cultivate in the largest possible number of our future citizens an appreciation of both the responsibilities and the benefits which come to them because they are American and are free. Now, by the time these words appeared in print, the war had been won. They were written, incidentally, while the war was still in doubt, and published almost immediately after the war was over. People had confidence then. And the Red Book, which announced the great mission of American education, became a national symbol of renewal after the war. So what does this thing say? I've met a number of people who have heard of the Red Book. I have met no more than maybe 1.5 who's actually read the thing, but it is probably the most important document in the 20th century history of American education. It says, to begin with, that education serves the interests of the nation, and it does so by calling out and fortifying those personal and social characteristics that are most conducive to political and economic and ideological success. Now, these attributes aren't American inventions, and they don't serve America directly or exclusively. I think it's fair to say that they are broadly human attributes that are commonly associated with, say, the great age of Athenian democracy, and refined by the, quote, Western tradition of which America was, at that post-war moment, claiming to be the preeminent representative. The pertinence to the American condition of the classical tradition is established immediately, and this is so interesting, with a couple of epigraphs placed at the beginning of the book. The first is from Thucydides, a speech in which Pericles states plainly the position of an exultant superpower eagerly awaiting a global expansion of its ambitions. "We need no Homer to praise us. Rather, we have opened the whole earth and sea to our enterprise and raised everywhere living memorials to our fortune." Pretty bold as a statement coming at the head of a book that talks about education. In the second epigraph from Plato's Republic, youth is described as the time when character is being molded and easily takes any impress one may wish to stamp on it. Is that your experience, by the way, the students among you? Anyhow, taken together, these two epigraphs suggest very forcibly that the goal of education was the formation of a citizenry fitted to the task of ruling the world. As we used to know, ruling requires coherence and discipline, and the Red Book sought to foster these by providing what it called a core curriculum, a phrase that's used often these days but was not used very often at all then. This core curriculum was thought to be knowledge that was essential for all students. And the committee noted that at Harvard there were very few requirements beyond the major. There's just a mass of electives. So you take the courses necessary for your major, and then you would head to those courses that you thought could do you some immediate good once you got out of college, like a professional or vocational utility. What the committee sought instead was an education that would represent a common discipline, a common view of life. In other words, they had very firmly fixed in mind the idea of one nation indivisible, and they thought that education could further this goal. In itself, the emphasis on a principle of unity in the curriculum was not altogether new. After all, in the 19th century, it was all unity. Everybody took the same courses, and the courses were crowned with a course on moral philosophy, often taught by the president of the college. What was new was the Red Book's explicitness about the geopolitical rationale of its program. The committee designed a core intended to manifest what it called, what have I done this? The character of the American society, a curriculum that would embody certain intangibles of the American spirit. Now, anchored by such a curriculum, education would be dedicated, literally, to the making of Americans, in large part through the inculcation of heritage. The Red Book concludes emphatically, in general education, the greatest incentive comes from the whole man's awareness of his share in the common fate, his part in the joint undertaking. Now, for me, the key words in this last sentence are the phrase "the whole man," which actually appeared in educational discourse before that. Ralph Waldo Emerson uses a similar concept and has appeared ever since then. This is another of the Red Book's distinctive contributions to underscore the concept of the whole man, this vision of humanity that education is supposed to serve. They devote a lot of attention to the whole man, whose development, they say, is the aim of a liberal education. Well, what is a whole man? When we read the book, the Red Book, we get a vision of the whole man as somebody who is like forged in the secret underground foundries of the Rotary Club. A whole man possesses poise and firmness, but also enjoys a rich emotional, spiritual, and even instinctual life. Whole men are reflective, curious, and appreciative of art, but they're also gregarious and at home in the world. They're committed to intelligent and principled action. They are full-blooded human beings as well as trained minds. Notice how this is not a scholar's vision at all. No, this is not the scholars. They're not dedicating education to the production of scholars or intellects alone. It's a much more kind of comprehensive concept of worldly competence that they're aiming at. Now, whole men differ from the partial, I think we can say that the pliant or morally amputated men of the totalitarian states against which we had just waged war, by being fully realized and morally sound individuals as well as loyal citizens of the nation. Again and again, the Red Book stresses that the American heritage honors equally the dignity and freedom of the individual and the needs of the common weal. Democracy, it says, is a community of free men. That is, it's a group united by the common possession of individual freedom. It's a group united by the common possession of individual freedom. The whole man is at once characteristically American and optimally human, combining its understandings of the national interest, the national heritage, and the national character. The Red Book declares in language that echoes Adams's Massachusetts Constitution, and as I'm going to try to argue, reverberates down to the present day, that the aim of education is mastery of life, and since living is an art, wisdom is the indispensable means to this end. Now, it's in the context of this new post-war national self-understanding that the humanities emerge as the central element of general education. The book is called, remember, General Education in a Free Society. It's in the humanities classroom, not the science, math, or social science classroom, that students are inspired, that the emotions as well as the intellect are engaged, that abstract values are shown being tested in action, and it's in the historical and literary text studied in the humanities that students encounter instructive images of mastery and wisdom. And within the humanities, and this warms my heart in particular, it's English that invariably sets the tone as the central humanistic study, offering, as they say, peculiar opportunities for realizing the goals of general education. Some would say they are indeed peculiar, but that wasn't their meaning. Now, considering the very elevated and generalizing tone of the entire book, the section on English is very striking. It is peculiar. In fact, it represents an account of literature and literary study that was edgy even in its time. This section, like the references to the whole man and the art of living, was the undoubted contribution of I.A. Richards, the British literary critic who had been a pioneer in the new field of English literature at Cambridge University. Richards had come to Harvard from Cambridge, that is, he went from Cambridge to Cambridge, in 1944 at the explicit invitation of Conant, who wanted him to sit on this committee. Unlike his fellow committee members, who were distinguished administrators at Harvard, Richards was an iconoclast and a polemicist. Before he arrived at Harvard, his work in criticism, which emphasized close reading, which I know at least, who went to school at Vanderbilt? Who was trained at Vanderbilt? There you go, right. That's right, particularly influenced by the doctrine of close reading, but that ultimately traces back to I.A. Richards. Close reading that focuses on the language and formal features of the text to the exclusion of anything extra-textual like biography or literary history. And this had exerted a very profound influence on several young men who subsequently became important critics, including in Britain, F.R. Leavis and William Empson. And then once in America, Richards continued to agitate. With a very compelling voice, influenced what became known as the New Criticism. whose practitioners included John Crowe Ransom, W.K. Wimsett, and Cleanth Brooks. Now, Richards, and I know people who knew him in later years, not when he looked like that, but when he was an old man. He was a terrifically charismatic person, and he apparently was a very brilliant presence on this committee, because the treatment of English, which is the core of the humanistic core of the core curriculum, so perfectly contradicts the rest of the Red Book that it's obvious he composed it without either opposition or assistance. They just said, handle it. That's why you were brought here, and that's your job. It's written like no other section in the book, in that it specifies an orthodoxy, how you have to teach this subject, beginning with a list of prevailing trends that are to be firmly discouraged. Stress on factual design. It's very moralistic. Emphasis on literary history, there can be none of that. Generalization as to periods, the Romantic period, the Victorian period, banished. In place of deeper familiarity, strained correlation with civics and social studies. For Richards, any correlation with anything else had to be strained. And then didacticism. You could not extract a lesson for living from literature. This was non-scholarly, non-academic, sub-scholarly, sub-academic. He also went into approved trends, that ethical results in literature are not to be seen as obedience to a body of precepts, but come in quickened imagination, heightened delight, and clearer perspective. And finally, there's a list of things to be stressed, including intensive close study, etc., and at the end, the utility, almost the necessity of metaphor. Now, this is presented in the Red Book as the consensus on the art and science of teaching English, a middle-of-the-road policy, unquote. But in fact, these lists constitute a compressed version of the program that the ambitious and determined and iconoclastic Richards had been promoting in Britain himself in a very lonely way for over 20 years. I'm certain that he was delighted to be coming to this new country where he could represent as a consensus something that he had been agitating for all by himself. And in its exclusion from consideration of anything outside the text, this program, of course, utterly negates the emphasis on heritage, much less on a particular national heritage, that the Red Book tries to place at the center of general education. Now, I've often wondered why the committee was willing to tolerate this. I've even wondered whether they actually read it before the book was published. But if they had, I think they might have let it get in, first of all, because he was just impossible to deal with, and second, because they kind of admired the overall moralism and individualism of Richards' approach, and they particularly liked his emphasis on charismatic teaching, which had been a New England tradition since, I guess, Jonathan Edwards. To Richards, who early in his career had to collect fees from his students when they entered the classroom, because Cambridge University would not support this experimental new discipline of English. They would let him have a room, but they wouldn't pay him. So he had to charge students and collect the money as they entered the classroom. To him, a certain kind of teaching was a professional necessity. And he built into the Red Book an impassioned evocation of the power of the pedagogue. The best way to infect the student with a zest for intellectual integrity is to put him near a teacher who is himself selflessly devoted to the truth, so that a spark from the teacher, so to speak, will leap across the desk into the classroom. The teacher is sitting behind a desk, so that the spark has to leap it. Kindling within the student the flame of intellectual integrity, which will thereafter sustain itself in a general conflagration of the entire university, I guess. Note that it's not learning that Richards is talking about. You know, he's not talking about learning anything in particular. In fact, anything that you might learn has already been ruled out in the trends that are to be firmly discouraged. What he's talking about is a kind of ignition, you know, an electrical process. Now, as incoherent as it was in the context of the Red Book's vision immediately became national policy through the agency of the 6-volume report from President Truman's Commission on Higher Education, which was convened the year following. The Truman Report, called Higher Education for American Democracy, repeats without significantly altering the analysis and many of the recommendations that had been formulated at Harvard. The report deplores specialization and instrumentalization, terms that the Red Book Committee would have found completely compatible, and it reiterates the idea of wholeness, Too often the graduate, it says, is educated and that he's acquired competence in some particular occupation, yet falls short of that human wholeness and civic conscience which the cooperative activities of citizenship require. To counteract this tendency, the report proposes a unified general education for American youth, one that would involve the transmission of a common cultural heritage towards a common citizenship in a free society. Education, the Truman Report says, is not an end in itself, but a means to a more abundant personal life and a stronger, freer social order. You know, these sound so dull, and yet I treasure these sentences. At one point, this was national policy. At one point, this was national policy. The goal of education was a means to a more abundant personal life and a stronger, freer social order. In each phrase, the Commission relays the message of the Red Book, translates it into action. Within 15 years, the college-age population doubled because community colleges were created by the Truman Report, and liberal education was instantiated on these terms. Now, the Truman Report doesn't actually pay much attention to the category of the humanities, but it does establish the sign under which all discussion was subsequently to proceed. Reflecting on the dangerous post-war world, dangers that hadn't really been apparent to Conant's committee because they were writing during the war, the Commission describes the present time in 1947 as a time of crisis. This crisis, in which the security of the nation depended in part on the effectiveness of the educational system, was, at the time the Truman Report was issued, 1947, situated in the world at large. It was a worldwide crisis of mankind because the threat of Stalinism was beginning to be really, really apparent. And the way that Europe was being reconfigured and the belligerence of the Soviet Union was beginning to seem like not just a point of marginal interest in faraway places, but as a real threat to the United States. But just a few years later, the crisis would become associated with the humanities themselves. In 1964, the first of what would eventually be dozens of publications with the title Crisis in the Humanities was published, a collection of very grumpy essays edited by the historian J.H. Plum that complained about fragmentation and jargon and a sense of drifting purposelessness. Oddly, at the same moment, 1964, a new document appeared, the Report of the Commission on the Humanities, sponsored by the American Council of Learned Societies. This document led directly to the creation the following year of the National Endowment for the Humanities, which is a pot of money that is used to support scholarship and state humanities councils and Messiah College. Congratulations. It was the best of times, it was the worst of times, for at the very moment that the humanities were said to be in disarray, the federal government was determining that the national interest required a new federal agency devoted to their support. Now, somehow, the very distinguished 20-member commission, which included a number of active scholars, including this guy, Robert Lumiansky, and I feel very close to him, although I never met him, because he taught at Tulane, where I taught. He taught at the University of North Carolina, where I have a position. And he was the mentor of my mentor, so I feel a kind of grandson relationship to him. But writing in 1964, at the very time the book, The Crisis of the Humanities, was published, this 20-member commission, filled with very distinguished people, had not heard of any crisis. In the context of the Soviet launch of Sputnik and the feared missile gap between the United States and the Soviet Union, and in the immediate aftermath of the Kennedy assassination, though, they were highly aware of a much more general crisis in which the humanities, they thought, might play a useful role if it didn't have its own crisis to deal with. The state of the humanities today creates a crisis for national leadership, they wrote, not because the humanities are suffering from fragmentation or jargon or specialization, but because they were so scandalously underfunded by comparison with science. And so in order to move the Congress to action, the Commission voiced its concerns in the most oracular terms possible. This is the single most inspiring statement about the humanities that I've been able to locate, defining the humanities as nothing less than the conservator of human being itself. The humanities are the study of what is most human. One cannot speak of history or culture apart from the humanities. They not only record our lives are the very substance they are made of. Their subject is every man. You might have noticed that it's always every man, the whole man. That was about to change, but had not changed yet. We propose, therefore, a program for all our people, a program to meet a need no less serious than that for national defense. We speak in truth for what is being defended, our beliefs, our ideals, our highest achievements. I want you to note how in a few effortless, even apparently contentless sentences, this passage manages to knot together the humanities with what is most human, American ideals, and national defense. Even more explicitly than the Red Book, this report identifies the American with the optimally human, and it preserves the Red Book's emphasis on wisdom. Remember, since living is an art, a term that it invokes in the context of a very threatening world. Democracy demands wisdom of the average man. Without the exercise of wisdom, free institutions and personal liberty are inevitably imperiled. To know the best that has been thought and said in former times can make us wiser than we otherwise might be. In this respect, the humanities are not merely our, but the world's best hope. Now, the inspiration for this passage is quite clearly the Red Book and the passages that I showed you earlier on, but the sense of imminent danger here indicates the changed situation. It is no longer the spacious, confident moment immediately following the Second World War. Now it's the darker, more anxious time of the Cold War. And interestingly, the concept of the humanities is as pertinent to the new context as it had been to the old. But even in the context of the Cold War, another aspect of the humanities struggles to declare itself in the Commission report. World leadership of the kind which has come upon the United States cannot rest solely upon superior force, vast wealth, or preponderant technology. Only the elevation of its goals and the excellence of its conduct entitle one nation to ask others to follow its lead. These are things of the spirit. If we appear to discourage creativity, to demean the fanciful and the beautiful, to have no concern for man's ultimate destiny, if in short, I love this move, if in short we ignore the humanities, then both our goals and our efforts to attain them will be measured with suspicion. Now, we're a generation after the Red Book, and the moralized virility of the whole man has begun to evolve in a new direction towards aestheticism, spirituality, creativity, even while retaining the connection between the humanities and American world leadership. Now, the National Endowment for the Humanities, which I mentioned earlier, was born of this shotgun marriage between national defense and things of the spirit in 1965 through an act of Congress that borrowed much of its language from this report, which was no surprise since Lumiansky also wrote the act of Congress as well as the report. He made every effort to preserve the spirit of the Red Book, but the tectonic shifts in the world since 1945 demanded a few rhetorical and more than rhetorical adjustments. I want you to compare, for example, the Red Book's invocation of wisdom. The aim of education is mastery of life, and since living is an art, wisdom is the indispensable means to this end, with the legislation that created the NEH 20 years later. Democracy demands wisdom and vision in its citizens. It must therefore foster and support a form of education and access to the arts and humanities designed to make people of all backgrounds and wherever located masters of their technology and not its unthinking servants. See, the one is clearly an attempt to rewrite the first. We still need wisdom, but wisdom is now demanded of citizens. And if the demand isn't met, citizens might be plunged into robotic servitude. At a deeper level, people are conceived here not as artists of their lives, in that wonderful phrase of the Red Book, but as subjects of the state. That is, as citizens, and with the assistance of the humanities, as masters of technology, which otherwise would threaten them. Under these very stressed terms, support began to flow from Washington, but the creation of this endowment both ensured federal support for the humanities and exposed them to political pressures. In the mid-1990s, former NEH chairs, William Bennett, who was one of my 4 predecessors as director of the National Humanities Center, it was his springboard to greatness, in fact, and Lynn Cheney, the wife of the former vice president, argued before a committee of Congress that humanistic scholars had so lost touch with the rhetoric of ennoblement and virtue, they were so indifferent to the burdens and responsibilities of world leadership, so politicized in their scholarship and teaching, that the NEH should be abolished rather than continue to enable them. That is, the two former directors of the NEH were arguing for Congress that they should abolish the agency. Their attacks revealed not just how vulnerable the humanities really were in the era of state support, but also a deep paradox in the American conception of the humanities. And this is really, I think, fascinating. Conceived as an expression of the American spirit, the humanities were also predicated on individual self-realization. They were, in other words, understood as a state-supported form of resistance to statism that would, in a further paradox, ultimately redound to the greater glory of the state. Like, how great is our state? We can devote state support to people who are completely independent of the state in their thinking. Now, when Bennett and Cheney and other conservatives did not see among the professoriate supported by the state any sign that they recognized, much less endorsed the whole program, they felt betrayed. Actually, they felt suckered. The NEH has never recovered from their attacks. Today it has about 1/3 the resources that it had at its peak in the 70s. The dwindling budget of the NEH, which would otherwise be of kind of marginal concern to us, expresses, I think, a national disappointment that the humanities have not actually made us wise or even manifest wisdom in themselves. Still, old habits die very hard, especially when funding is at stake, and more than 20 years after the fall of the Soviet Union, the NEH continues to state its mission in the terms of 1965, when the humanities represented the nation's high qualities as a leader. Here is their website. I've singled out the relevant passage. Because democracy demands wisdom, straight from the Red Book, the National Endowment for the Humanities serves and strengthens our republic by promoting excellence in the humanities and conveying the lessons of history to all Americans. And in 2005, the endowment celebrated its 40th birthday by issuing a coffee table book whose title recalled the Cold War, when the nation first tied its geopolitical interests to education and scholarship, Fearless and Free. Now, I would have thought that 1965 was about the last time when this linkage could be made. But when in November 2010, Cornell President David Skorton called for a national campaign on behalf of the humanities, he cited the experience of military leaders who spoke about winning the so-called hearts and minds of people of other countries. And this project, Skorton explained, requires that we understand the language, culture, religion, and values of those societies, and that's the humanities. Now, I noticed that you had Jim Leach as a speaker here a couple of years ago, and Leach took an entirely different tack, explaining that the humanities helped keep us out of war rather than win wars. I'm not personally sure that the humanities either win wars or keep us out of wars, but it's interesting to see that the arguments about the humanities are still so tied to the concept of national defense. Well, let's return to our historical account. By the late 1970s, many Americans were experiencing a different kind of crisis, which President Jimmy Carter, who has also spoken here, I saw, characterized in a speech delivered on July 15, 1979, as a crisis of confidence. This is a very famous address if you didn't live through it. And he identified in two threats to the nation's security. The first was dependence on foreign energy. The second, which acquired the name of malaise. I went back and read that speech, and that term does not actually occur in the speech, but it's become known to history as the malaise speech. This is more abstract but deeper, and as Carter said, was nearly invisible in ordinary ways. This was a crisis affecting the very heart and soul and spirit of our national will. We can see this crisis in the growing doubt about the meaning of our own lives and the loss of a unity of purpose for our nation. The most obvious sign that something had gone awry was the widespread tendency to worship self-indulgence and consumption. But we've discovered that owning things and consuming things cannot fill the emptiness of lives which have no confidence or purpose. It's interesting to note that this speech is widely thought to have lost Carter the presidency. People don't like a downer. Is an engineer by training, but soon thought to become a humanist, that is, a novelist and a historian. Carter was reaffirming in the throes of a present crisis, and in a somewhat more melancholic tone, the analysis of the threats to America's cultural and political health that had informed the discourse of the humanities for the previous 30 years. Now, that speech provides the context for the last one of the official, that is the committee pronouncements that I'm going to be talking about. A 1980 book sponsored by the Rockefeller Foundation called The Humanities in American Life. This is another one of those books, like virtually everything I've forced you to read so far. It's not a book meant to be read. You know, it doesn't seek readers. It's a book meant to document the fact that it has been written. So that people can say, as my distinguished, as these distinguished people have said, then pick out a phrase or two. And of course, as I've been arguing, it's the same phrase or two that is picked out every time. Anyhow, this is a product not of a 20-member commission like the other one, but of a 32-member commission chaired by the president of Stanford. And it began by announcing its own malaise, a profound disquiet about the state of the humanities in our culture. Now, like their distinguished predecessors, these distinguished people defer to their distinguished predecessors, evoking wisdom and mastery and heritage. And they simply repeat many of the 1964 report's terms: critical judgment, aesthetic appreciation, moral decision-making, and things of the spirit. And they repeat, too, the claim that the fate of the nation is bound up with humanistic scholarship. We must stress how limited our sense of national purpose is, indeed how imperiled our civilization is, if the humanities are exiled to a peripheral role of irrelevance. You can see this is already a thought. Now, much of the emphasis of this report falls on the need for increased funding. In fact, by 1980, it seems to have become impossible to think about the humanities without including in your thoughts some bitter reflections on money. But the Rockefeller report is not just an arrangement of the available cliches in the form of a funding proposal, although it is that. It registers its moment by contributing three new elements to the discourse of the humanities. First, the crisis in the humanities is now positioned not in the world at large, like in the Truman Report said, this is a time of crisis, and the crisis is in the world, so worldwide crisis of mankind. No, and it's not in the funding of the humanities, like the 1964 report said. It's in the practice of the humanities disciplines themselves, that it's gone from the world to the support structure for the humanities, and now finally the evil is within. Scholarship, the report says, has not escaped the general loss of purpose that Carter was complaining about. Many would argue that the humanities are in crisis and would describe this crisis as symptomatic of a general weakening of our vision and resolve. Second innovation of this report, while the ACLS report of 16 years earlier mentions the fanciful and beautiful, the Rockefeller report dives much further into the sanctuary of the inner life, where it says the humanities also live. It says that there are other values besides civic ones, and they are often found in privacy, intimacy, and distance from civic life. The humanities sustain this second conception of individuality as deeply rooted as the other in our cultural inheritance. The humanities offer intensely personal insights into the recesses of experience. Now, I was certain that I knew who wrote this, but I was able to ask Helen Vendler, seated here in the lower left, and she actually confirmed it. She said, yeah, I insisted that they stick that in. And it bears her contrarian stamp. She's still alive and kicking at Harvard. And while it's consistent with the softening or de-virilizing trend of official pronouncements that I already noted in the Things of the Spirit in the previous report, it also marks a moment of genuine dissensus on the committee, when the discourse of entirely private reflection and sensibility, an interior zone of secrecy that is untouched by civic life, untouched by the external world, becomes, if only for a moment, detached from both the rhetoric of citizenship and virtue and from the increasingly unpersuasive arguments about the humanities as the last redoubt of democracy. She obviously doesn't care about any of that. What she cares about is these intense inner experiences. The manifold civic and moral excellences of the whole man have at last met a counterforce capable of contesting their centrality. It's worth noting that Helen Vendler, along with Nan Cohan, who became president of Duke and Wellesley, and Jill Kerr Conway, who was president of Smith, are 3 women on this panel. The previous commission, the 1964 one, had just 1 woman on it, and the Red Book, of course, had no women at all. It's one of the reasons why you keep hearing about the whole man. The perspective of the individual that I've been talking about here is linked to the third and the perhaps most interesting contribution to the discourse on the humanities that is introduced by the Rockefeller Report: private funding. This is a far more fascinating subject than you might think. And it's one that, in my position as director of a research institute that always has to raise money, has become very much to the fore of my consciousness. Philanthropic support from foundations and corporations and individuals, the report notes, provides multiple centers of initiative and response and often attaches fewer political and bureaucratic strings to grants. It can allow more freedom for innovative and controversial projects. It sounds empty, but it is not. It's far from empty. It is the opposite of empty. This recognition represents an even more decisively American contribution to the concept of the humanities than the rhetoric of national identity and security, because it underscores not the perspective of the state, but of the entrepreneurial individual operating in a free intellectual market. Now, one of the most distinctive features of the humanities in the United States is the involvement of private individuals who have supported scholarship through philanthropy, often through private foundations such as the Rockefeller, which supported this book. The connection between the humanities and private philanthropy in America, which is not replicated anywhere else in the world, has been deep and determining, maybe not as broad-based as people might wish, but very profound. Humanists work in buildings, including libraries, named for the individuals who built them. Their salaries, their research expenses, their conference travel expenses, their sabbatical salaries are drawn at least in part in an endowment created by individuals. The presses and journals that publish their work may be supported by grants from individuals or foundations. The very colleges and the universities that employ them are, of course, supported by massive development operations that train their sites on individual donors. It's surprising, it's shocking how imperfectly most American scholars grasp the fact that their work is at every level and at every point supported by private gifts. And I'm delighted to see that Messiah College does not make this mistake. You could not enter this room without passing by an expression of the college of gratitude for the Palmers. I spent 20 minutes before the lecture in what's called the Green Room, which is a concrete block of space. It's the Katzman Seminar Room. And I think there's the Sawatsky lobby out here. Everything is named. This is very, very good policy. Even some of those scholars who are fortunate enough to hold endowed chairs are oblivious to the perspective or life history of the donor of the gift that pays their salary. So on the principle that you really ought to know your friends, I want now to consider, as an instance of the philanthropic perspective, a recent essay by one of the most generous funders of the humanities in the United States, Richard J. Franke, formerly chairman of the John Nuveen Company, founder of the Chicago Humanities Festival, as well as the Franke Institute for Humanities at the University of Chicago. This is a little awkward for me because I don't want what follows to be taken as a dismissal or criticism of Mr. Franke at all. Since I wrote this and the present time, I've become very friendly with Rich Franke. And I want to underscore that I have the highest admiration for everything that he's done. All I'm going to be emphasizing is how differently he thinks from the way scholars think. He wrote an essay called The Power of the Humanities and a Challenge to Humanists. It appeared in a journal in 2009. It's a collection of 12 essays, and his is the only one written by a non-academic. Now, Franke, you'll immediately see, does not think or write like a scholar. His essay is a conspicuous outlier in this collection. It does not resemble them at all. But he's completely at home in the discourse of the humanities that I've been talking about, because he shares with that discourse a few basic convictions. He says the humanities protect and give life to our most enduring values. Most scholars, it's not that they don't believe this, they just never think that thought. That they prepare people for life, especially moral decision-making. Many scholars, I think, are actively skeptical about this. That they relate to robust and prosperous citizenship, big yawn. That they have suffered neglect over the last few decades, well, duh. and that despite all these quite obvious points, humanists themselves have not succeeded in explaining the value of their work. That value, in Frankie's mind, is completely cashed out after graduation, after you leave the academy. The primary value of the humanities is their contribution to developing judgment, which is useful in, for example, business, which is why Frankie organized staff seminars at Nuveen in which professors came in to lead discussions of Saul Bellow or Antigone. The humanities, Frankie says, are vital to public life. They help us imagine the consequences of our actions and give us the tools to make informed policy decisions. Even more, the moral, aesthetic, and spiritual discoveries of the humanities reveal what is common to the human experience, common, one nation indivisible, and provide the foundation for a successful and fulfilling life. He almost says they make us whole men, but he meant it. It's difficult to imagine a clearer statement. Its lucidity reflects the confidence that's born of a lifetime of professional success and by a long tradition of discourse, last parts of which I've been showing you, that back him up. And yet many scholars who read Frankie's essay undoubtedly felt an acute sense of discomfort, even perhaps embarrassment. But why? It can't be because he says untrue things or unworthy things. How could anybody reject the proposition that the humanities help us lead worthy lives? Would we rather think that they help us lead unworthy lives? No, the reason, I think, for their embarrassment is that Frankie has a completely different orientation to the humanities from that of scholars. In fact, in this essay, he betrays very little interest in scholarship. He scarcely mentions the academy except as the place where teaching happens. He's decidedly liberal, as in liberal arts in his approach. His understanding is drawn not from professional scholarship, but from amateur enthusiasm, lifelong amateur enthusiasm. And the entire argument, it's very interesting, is wrapped tightly in a coil of utility that circles around to profits, which he construes in a quite literal way. He says, talking about leading these seminars for staff executives, he says, you can make money with this stuff. I've done so. I'm here to tell you. Scholars, it need hardly be pointed out, have other concerns. Whatever else they are not amateurs. The credentialing process kind of beats it out of them. New graduate students may begin with a love of their subject and a desire to do the world some good, but graduate training, it's been pointed out, has a deliberalizing effect on them. It structures their thinking, it disciplines their mode of expression, and professionalizes their relationship to other fields. A loose comment made by a graduate student to the effect that studying Saul Bellow really demonstrates the value of emotional honesty would be too honest by half. It would signal professional immaturity. So the image that Frankie presents to the humanists is a kind of professional embarrassment to a scholar. It's like having your mom show your date, your baby picture or something. But at this point, an irony appears. Philanthropists like Frankie hold the humanities in great esteem. They understand how money is made. They understand in particular the notion of market share. They value the humanities in part for their distinctiveness. Above all, they understand that the goal of wise investment is long-term gains. This understanding can lead them to an appreciation of what has been called the usefulness of useless knowledge. Knowledge, that is, that produces no immediate benefit, it's not directed towards any particular goal, but might result in some distant and more unpredicted but more enduring reward. Taking the long view, philanthropists like Frankie place their bets on the proposition that the humanities represent a particularly useful and pleasurable and worthy and instructive form of useless knowledge. And moreover, while many philanthropists are politically conservative, they support the academy in the full knowledge that most professors are not. They're willing to look beyond politics, even if the professoriate sometimes doesn't be able to imagine that there is anything beyond politics. In short, the diminishing number of philanthropists are the idealists, and the increasingly dependent scholars are sometimes the cynics. I think this calls for a rethink on the part of the scholars. Now, so far I've focused on two kinds of discourse about the humanities, which is official statements by committees and commissions, and then the discourse of philanthropy. Most scholars regard both courses as being completely detached from what they do. Like, you can blather on, this has nothing to do with what I actually do, is the attitude. So I want to close by considering an instance of a scholarly discourse on the humanities. It's a scholar's discourse. Andrew Delbanco's 1999 book, The Real American Dream, A Meditation on Hope. Now, this is not a book about the humanities. It's kind of an uncategorizable combination of history and polemic and sermon and personal testament. It's a wide-ranging meditation on the nation's fantasy life. But since the humanities are a big part of that fantasy life, and the part that Delbanco spends his life helping us dream, his book can also, I think, be read as an angled account of the humanities in America. That's how I'm going to do so. The Real American Dream begins not with a discussion of the ways that Americans have dreamt their particular dream, but rather with an analysis of the reasons that people dream at all, which is, he says, to escape the gnawing sense that life is totally futile and pointless. This basic response to educational or to existential terror is a species characteristic. We all do it. But Americans, he says, have devoted themselves to this kind of dreaming with particular intensity, beginning with the Puritans. Now, over the course of the 19th century, stories of a vengeful and omnipotent God, the kind that the Puritans told themselves, were replaced by uplifting stories about the nation. Then after the 1960s, Delbanco says, these stories were in turn replaced with stories centering on self. So you've got God, nation, and self. These are the epochs of the nation's history, two phases of coherent belief, followed by a third phase of incoherence and nervous waiting. The Real American Dream concerns then the stories that Americans tell to counteract their own sense of helplessness and futility. But the term Delbanco prefers, the one that hovers over the entire book and the one that I signaled in my title, is melancholy, whose first theorist in an American context was Alexis de Tocqueville, who identified melancholy as an attribute of democracy itself. In a passage that Delbanco cites, de Tocqueville said, in a democracy, I love this passage, it has the early eloquence that de Tocqueville often commands. In a democracy, men easily attain a certain equality of condition, but they can never attain as much as they desire. Ain't it the truth? It perpetually retires from before them, yet without hiding itself from their sight. In other words, they can still see it, and in retiring, draws them on. That is the reason for the strange melancholy that haunts inhabitants of democratic countries in the midst of abundance. In other words, he's saying democracy creates fantasies of wholeness and integration, with promises of abundance and enough actual abundance to encourage the feeling that maybe those promises will one day be redeemed. America is in fact the most melancholy of nations. And so, Delbanco says, his meditation on hope will also be a theory of melancholy in its particular American form. Now, he is particularly melancholic about our own era, which seems to him a time of singular emptiness compared to its impressive predecessors. The Puritan God, after all, was horrifying, but you have to admit, impressive. The nation, as articulated by such figures as Jefferson and Whitman and Lincoln and Melville, could be inspiring. But the current phase of self in Delbanco's account is just pathetic. We slipped into incoherence in the mid-1960s. In fact, he gives it a date. I think it's August 19th, 1964, when the Mississippi Freedom Delegation was refused seating at the Republican Convention. According to Delbanco, or a source that he cites, at that point the nation just slipped over. We lost sense of the public good and began to become the narcissistic 60s. Just as the NEH was getting started, incidentally, something gave way in American society. The dream of nation collapsed into a daydream of personal gratification. The notion of a common destiny worth tears and sacrifice was abandoned in favor of a meretricious fantasy of consumption. And there we sit, miserable amid our possessions. The whole abysmal situation brings out the Puritan moralist, or maybe it brings out the Jimmy Carter in Delbanco. And what does the plenty avail us, he says. Now, at such moments, Delbanco, who's a Harvard PhD, declares his affiliation with the sensibility informing the Red Book and the subsequent discourse of the humanities. This sensibility is organized around a few key concepts: a concern for culture and inner enrichment, a rejection of materialism, an aspiration to reach beyond the academy, beyond knowledge itself, to something that could be called wisdom. But maybe the most tellingly humanistic feature of the real American dream is Delbanco's insistence that we should now abort this brief and inglorious era of self and move on to the world in which people can construct their identities as part of mankind in general. This would seem to be a fourth phase, so you go from God, nation, self, let's get rid of that as soon as possible, world. But in fact, it's clear that one of the appeals of world for Delbanco is that it rehabilitates phase two of nation and expands it, because the real American dream, according to Delbanco, has always been a global dream. To be really American has always meant to see something beyond America. Delbanco quotes with a palpable thrill the message from Melville's White Jacket, in which the manifest destiny of America is announced. We Americans are the peculiar chosen people, the Israel of our time. We bear the ark of the liberties of the world. God has predestinated mankind expects great things from our race, and great things we feel in our souls. And let us always remember that with ourselves, almost for the first time in the history of earth, national selfishness is unbounded philanthropy. For we cannot do a good to America, but we give alms to the world. Now, in citing this passage as a way of urging Americans in particular to see beyond America, Delbanco reaffirms the connection made in the Red Book and repeated several times since between the American and the human. And of course, the mention of philanthropy brings us back to our previous theme and enables us to grasp together this distinctively American nexus, a dream of human fulfillment and what the Truman Report calls more abundant personal lives, achieved through liberal education centering on the humanities, a society united through the common possession of such abundance, and private support for the humanistic scholarship that will help us achieve it. On this last point, Delbanco's book is particularly exemplary. It was actually a series of talks that were delivered by the Julian Clarence Levy Professor in the Humanities, that's Delbanco's rather grand title at Columbia, as the William E. Massey Senior Lectures in the History of American Civilization at Harvard. The talks that comprise this book were underwritten by philanthropy and are in substance and style entirely consistent with the love of humanity that is the core definition of philanthropy. So with Delbanco as a distinguished representative of the ethos of the humanities, we can say that the humanities in America are not just supported by the philanthropy, they're not just brushed by the spirit of philanthropy, they are the academic form of philanthropy. Now, most revealingly, Delbanco has also put a name, melancholy, signifying lack or incompletion, to something that had in the other works that I've discussed only been very obliquely implied. As we've seen, the discourse of the humanities is full of images of enrichment and repletion and satisfaction, spiritual enlightenment. The humanities are the answer to our prayers. They are the path to enrichment. They are the key to an integrated and fulfilled life. The humanities is the name that we have given to the luxurious state that we, or maybe our grandchildren, will enjoy once the present crisis is past. A deep and persistent sense of longing, a melancholy yearning for a fulfillment that perpetually eludes us, haunts the humanities, which have always in the United States signified not just a set of academic disciplines, but also a phantasmatic elsewhere, a utopian place where we can be made whole and complete, always in sight, and yet always receding before us, a kind of America of the academy. Now, there's reason enough to feel that the humanities have sometimes been very poorly served by their advocates who have promised more than any mere coursework could deliver. Possibly, some might feel we should just dial down this overinflated rhetoric. But if the humanities were to renounce altogether their, you might think of as self-dramatizing addiction to the rhetoric of crisis, if they surrendered their pretension to wisdom, they might well be trading their birthright for a mess of pottage. They could become drier, smaller, more realistic, less exposed to attack or ridicule, but they would also sacrifice the questing and exploratory quality that makes people sometimes care about them. They would, I fear, become flat and colorless, defined as a mere sector of knowledge, and this would encourage the view that their contributions could be quantified and measured. perhaps by some expert entity such as the Arts and Humanities Research Council in the United Kingdom, which describes its knowledge transfer strategy in these terms. I can't read this. It's not rebuffs articulation, but I want you to take a look at it. Yes. Had enough? Notice the apologetic last line, where a significant arts and humanities academic element is evident. It's difficult for a humanist to read this without laughing. It makes Dilbert sound like Oprah or something. But in the United Kingdom, I assure you, nobody is laughing. Not the professors, and certainly not the not the AHRC, excuse me. The land of Shakespeare and Jane Austen and Handel and Masterpiece Theater has given oversight of arts and humanities to an entity whose job is to advise the TSB, which is itself situated in the BIS, the Department of Business, Innovation and Skills. And the not unexpected consequence is a 100% cut in state funding for arts and humanities. 100%. Such an outcome is not only conceivable there, it has been effected there, and it's still slightly far-fetched here, although less and less so, because I would submit Great Britain has no tradition of mass liberal education, and more specifically because the humanities are not indigenous. In fact, the term humanities is a recent addition to the lexicon. Britain may be unusually rich in terms of the subject matter of the humanities, but the academic category of the humanities does not have deep roots there. There's no John Adams in the British tradition. Arts and letters is the more traditional term. There's no sense in Great Britain that the character or the aspirations of the nation are at stake in them. Accordingly, there's no built-in ideological support for the humanities. There's no defense that is rooted in tradition against the vulgar but brutally effective gibberish of the AHRC. To rebaptize arts and letters as arts and humanities, and then to describe them in terms of a knowledge transfer strategy, is already to begin the work of elimination. Now, to avoid sharing the fate of our British colleagues, I would suggest that humanists in this country should accept the burden of the implications of the humanities, which include a utopian unreality, a green light at the end of the dock, as one of the elements of their work. Indeed, I'd go further and say that humanists would do well to, even in this globalizing age, to double down and embrace, with appropriate reservations, the connection between the humanities and the idea of America. Now, those reservations are numerous and they're pretty significant. I would have to stipulate that Americans do not enjoy privileged access to the fullness of the human condition. We are not, as it turns out, the chosen people. The humanities do not secure moral citizenship, nor do they demonstrate the elevation of American goals or the excellence of American conduct. I'd go further. They do not testify to America's world leadership in things of the spirit. They are not really the world's best hope. But the fundamental idea animating the humanities of promoting human self-understanding, self-realization, and a measure of both cultural cohesion and intercultural understanding on a mass scale through a program of liberal education with a humanistic core, that is a noble idea. And Americans can take legitimate pride in the fact that once upon a time, it was national policy. It's a policy predicated on confidence that has served the United States well because it's integral to American self-understanding in a way that the discourse of the AHRC, which in its absolute human zero speaks the language of panic and defeat, is not. The humanities were made in America as an image of American aspirations, and we permit the humanities to be weakened or denigrated or relegated to the margins at the cost of those aspirations. Humanities make sense only in a society in which authority is mobile and the rules are changeable. They flourish in flux, the extreme form of which is called crisis. Humanists should understand their work not as a set of professional practices that are unfortunately afflicted with crisis, but as part of the way that we think in and of crisis. To imagine a social or moral or political crisis, we might say, is to imagine the humanities. Lucky for us, there's no end of crisis in sight. Thank you.